We've spent some time talking about Wi-Fi communication standards. We've also spent some time seeing how you can actually crack WPA2 passphrases. So what can we do to prevent those things from happening? How do we harden our Wi-Fi environment? There are a bunch of settings that you can enable to do just that. Let's go over some of them. First of all, enabling radius authentication. IEEE 802.1x is the standard for that. That means instead of using a pre-shared key configured on the wireless access point or router, why don't we have it forward authentication requests elsewhere to a centralized authentication server, which means that users would have to authenticate the way they would normally authenticate to a network, for example, with a username and a password, and maybe a smart card and a PIN or a PKI certificate. That's way more secure than just using a single passphrase, which, by the way, is the same for everybody. Everybody knows the passphrase. That's not nearly as secure as using radius authentication. Now, when we do that, there are a couple of variations like EAP-FAST. Now, EAP stands for Extensible Authentication Protocol, in case you were wondering. This means that we don't use PKI certificates for authentication. We still use a shared secret. Okay, well, is that really much better than a pre-shared key? Not much. But we also have options like EAP-TLS, Transport Layer Security. This means that both the server that we are connecting to, the authentication server, and the client, they both have to have PKI certificates, and both devices must trust each other's certificates. That is a little bit more secure. It's harder to forge than simply trying to figure out a username and password or trying to crack a pre-shared key. Then we have EAP-TTLS, an extra T in there. Now these are the fine-grained details that you might get an exam question on. So with EAP-TTLS authentication, what happens is it requires a server certificate, not a client certificate like EAP-TLS does. This only requires a server certificate. Remember that. So it encapsulates radius messages or encrypts them. Then we have protected EAP, which requires a server certificate, but it has a different format for transmitting those messages over the network. So what it does is it encapsulates those EAP messages. Now, what else can we do besides authentication protocols for the Wi-Fi network? What else can we do to make it more secure? Change the default credentials to sign into the access point to manage it. If the default credentials are admin, change them, because everyone else is going to know that. Hide the SSID. Well, wait a minute, hide what? Hide the name of the wireless network. You can disable broadcast. That means that when people are on their smartphone looking at wireless networks, they might see that there's a hidden network, but they don't see the name of it. And they have to know the name to be able to connect. They would also have to know, for example, the pre-shared key or credentials to sign in if radius authentication is enabled. We can also enable MAC address filtering. Now, we know that MAC addresses are hardware addresses for a network interface and that they apply to layer 2 of the OSI model. Even home class type Wi-Fi routers will allow you to configure an allow or a deny list with MAC addresses. For example, only allow the MAC address of my laptop, my tablet, and my smartphone to connect. Everything else is not allowed. Now, despite the fact that we know that MAC addresses are easily spoofed, again, it's still a good thing to do as opposed to not doing it at all. Really, it's a combination of these things that really make it tight. We should also be using WPA3 Enterprise. Mike talked very well about all of these types of security protocols, WPA, WEP, WPA3. Use WPA3 if your device supports it. If it doesn't, trash it and get one that does. So what you want to do is you want to enable radius server authentication along with WPA3. What else can we do? Well, we know that a wireless access point emanates a signal over a certain distance. And with some access points, you can control that distance. You can actually say, I want extended wireless range. Don't do that beyond what you need. For example, in an office building on the first floor in a busy city, do you really want the wireless signal going out into the street or across the street? Why would you do that? You're kind of almost asking for trouble. So we can control that as well to harden our wireless network. Then we have the notion of a captive portal. Now, I know you've seen this. For example, it's a landing page or a website that you might see when you are in close proximity to a public Wi Fi hotspot. Now, it may or may not ask you to sign in with an account. You might have to pay to do it. You might have a free account. You might just have to accept terms of use. So, for example, that you won't do anything illegal through this public Wi Fi hotspot. So what's interesting about this is if you've ever been to an airport or a library, or if you've ever been to a coffee shop, that's the landing page you get in your web browser. Usually it pops up automatically. That really depends on your device. And you can say, yep, I want to connect to Wi-Fi. Maybe it's free Wi-Fi. You accept terms and agreements if you have to, and then you click a button and all of a sudden you can get to the internet. That's a captive portal. You know what it really is too? It's a forward proxy, isn't it? It goes all the way up to layer 7 of the OSI model because you have a fully functional IP configuration. You just can't get out to the internet. How is that? Proxy server. That's really where captive portals come from. So, having talked about these things, why don't we take a look at a sample wireless router emulator, specifically a D-Link one that I'll show you online. It looks just like the real thing. And let's take a look at some of the things we might do to harden that access point. Okay, so here I've got a D-Link access point web configuration tool. And it's asking me to set up the wireless router. Well, I want to do it manually. I want to look at the settings. So I'm going to click wireless settings over on the left. The first thing we can consider doing is either leaving or changing the name of the wireless network. Now this is a D-Link wireless router, and so by default, the wireless network name is D-Link. Now what you don't want to do, presumably, is if this is a wireless access point in the boardroom on floor 12, you don't want to call it boardroom floor 12. Because anyone that's scanning for wireless networks is going to know exactly where that actually is. And they might say, oh, that's where they have important meetings and discussions about financial matters. I definitely want to break into that one. Don't name it something that people can easily determine what it really means or where it actually is. D-Link, in my humble opinion, is just fine. Now, mind you, of course, people have to know that when you connect to the wireless network, it connect to D-Link. And if there's a lot of D-Links in the same area, there's a lot of D-Link networks. So then we have that side of the coin. So try to find a balance between those two issues. Then we can do things like enable extended range mode. Well, you might actually want to turn that off if you don't want to extend the wireless range beyond what it's already doing, if it's already acceptable. Enable hidden wireless. Remember we talked about Wi-Fi beacon frames? By enabling hidden wireless, all we're doing is suppressing the name of the wireless network from those beacon frames that are sent out approximately every 100 milliseconds. And that means that nearby client devices will only see that there's some kind of a hidden network, but they don't know the name of it. And again, they have to know the name to connect. Down below, we have the security mode. Now, this is really important because this is where we can choose to enable WEP. No, we would never choose to enable WEP. There's just not a good reason to ever do that other than playing around and testing. We could enable WPA. Well, why would I do that when I have WPA2? Now, I hate to say it, but I've been in some consulting situations where clients insisted, no, we have to use WPA because we have older wireless devices that only support WPA. They don't support WPA2. Of course, what you want to say is you need to upgrade those to at least WPA2. These days, WPA3, and at some point very soon, WPA4. So here I can choose WPA2 wireless security. Now, down below, I can choose the cipher. Mike talked a lot about ciphers in Chapter 2 when he talked about crypto. It's an encryption algorithm. So we can specify Advanced Encryption Standard, AES, and so on. Now down below, it's set to personal, which means we're entering in a passphrase, a pre-shared key. That's symmetric encryption. Everyone has the same key and one key encrypts, one decrypts. That's fine, but definitely not the most secure solution. We've just finished saying we should be using enterprise radius server authentication. When I switch it to enterprise, we then have the option of filling in details for 2 radius servers. That's going to vary depending on the model. What you're doing is specifying the IP address of the radius servers, the ports that they are listening on, by default that's 1812, and a shared secret. Shared secret? Well, that's how this access point can at least be allowed to send authentication requests to the centralized radius server somewhere else. So the shared secret is configured here, and it's also configured on the radius server. It just allows this device to submit authentication requests to that server. So these are just a couple of examples of how you might actually go about hardening a wireless network, whether it's at home or whether it's in the enterprise. There are many other settings that will vary depending on the model of wireless router that you're using, but this gives us a good idea for how to get started with securing it.